Well, this also showed me that God has promised us great things, and we don't claim or receive these things because we allow our fears to get a hold of us. We let our fears, which is straight from the enemy, get in our minds, and we might hear whispers from saying, you can't get through this, you can't, God can't use you, he doesn't love you, and we let those things permeate in our minds, and we start to believe those things. And instead of grabbing the promise of freedom, or the promise of healing, or the promise of blessing, we let the enemy take them from us because our fear is just so great. Now, if we go back to the story, at this point we read that Moses and Aaron, they fall on their faces before the congregation. Now, let me tell you about Moses and Aaron. I talked a little bit about Moses before. He's the one who brought them out of slavery in Egypt. Well, when they were walking through the wilderness, God started to speak to Moses real strongly. And it even talks about he met him. God came and talked to him in the form of a cloud on top of a mountain. And so they started to build this strong relationship where God was starting to speak to Moses what he needed to speak to his children. But Moses had a hard time speaking. He wasn't a great public speaker, so he pretty much elected Aaron to speak for him. So basically, God spoke to Moses, and Moses spoke to Aaron what he needed to say to the people of God, the children of Israel. And so these are very prominent men in Israel. And we read at this point that they fell on their face before all the congregation. Now, typically, when you hear about someone falling on their face, nowadays, if you're doing that in church, it's a good thing because it's a sign of submission. So they fell on their face. And to me, though, at this point in the story, though, it shows that they were submitting to their complaints, because we read just a minute ago that they were ready to select a leader to take them back to Egypt. And then they fell on their face, almost like, hey, select me to take you. And this reminds me that we can have, great faith, or we can say we have great faith in God, and we can say everything's going well, and we say we love Jesus, and we show up at church, we show up at youth group, but then every time we hear the world's logic, or we get into a discussion with somebody about Christ who doesn't believe in Christ, and they start saying, things that science taught them and all this stuff, that we get afraid again, and we submit. We say, yeah, you might be right. Even if we don't even believe them sometimes, we still submit, and we shut our mouths. Well, Joshua and Caleb, they didn't lay their heads down. Instead, out of great frustration, they tore their clothes. In Numbers 14, 6 through 9, it says, "But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. And they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, 'The land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them.'" Now there's a lot there, but like I mentioned in the beginning, they tore their clothes. And this shows their great frustration. Many times in the Bible it speaks about people tearing their clothes, and I'm not going to get too much into it, but a great example is Job. And if you read that story, he goes through many things during that time because the devil is trying to test his faith, and so he loses his house, he loses his family, he loses all his belongings. And then by the end of the story, he's got all these blisters and scars and boils all over his body, and he's going through such pain and agony. And he tears his clothes and he shaves his head. Or if you want a better illustration of that, something you might understand a little better is if we look at these new movies that come out, with Marvel comics and stuff, and we look at the Avengers, and one of the characters in that is Hulk. You know, a big guy who, when he gets angry, his clothes tear. So they were so frustrated that they tore their clothes. And, you know, they told him, basically, you know, that this is a good land, and you're throwing it away and you're being fearful, but we have the Lord with us. Because they were questioning the Lord that already provided for them over and over again. They were questioning the God that took them out of bondage and slavery in Egypt, and even provided manna, bread out of heaven, for them to eat. They were questioning that God. And when Israel heard this, instead of saying, yeah, you're right, God has provided for us. God brought us out of our bondage. God has fed us. He has led us to a great land. Instead of saying that, they wanted to stone Caleb and Joshua. They were ready to stone Caleb and Joshua. And I see this a lot in youth today, especially in youth groups. I see it in our youth group where we start to disobey God, and we feel this fear and stuff, and we start to do our own thing, and we start to do stupid things. We start to make some mistakes, and you'll have some people in your life, like your leaders, who really love you, who really care for you, who knows what's better for you. And so they'll try to give you some correction in your life. They might try to tell you some things that you need to hear, but it's hard to hear because the truth is hard to hear. And they're basically like Joshua and Caleb, trying to get you in the will of God, trying to get you to that path to what God has promised you. And instead of listening to them and accepting what we have to say, you know, you turn your head and you tell us to shut up, or you know, you say not to get in your business, or you just don't talk. And this is what was basically going on with Israel. Well, as we read on, it talks about God's wrath comes against the people. And he even wants to destroy them for their disobedience and unbelief. Now remember, this is Old Testament. Now, Numbers 14:12, it says, I will disinherit them, and I'll make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. And so who knows that if God wanted to, he could wipe us off the face of this planet in an instant. But at this moment, Moses intercedes for the people and asks for God to pardon their sin. And God does pardon their sin. But he also says those who rejected him will not enter Canaan. They'll have to live in the wilderness until they die. It speaks of their carcasses being buried there in the wilderness. And so when Moses goes and tells Israel this, that they shall not go into Canaan, once again they disobey, and now they want to go into Canaan. Which is kind of funny, right? Because they didn't want to go into Canaan.